Good evening. Thank you all for being here. I hope you're all having a safe and healthy start to your summer. I am Helene Paul, Chair of our Jewish Community Relations Council. JCRC is the public policy, community relations, and advocacy arm of the Jewish Federation of South Palm Beach County. Community education is chief among our JCRC's priorities. And after an unprecedented 15 months of COVID-19, I know we're all eager to hear what tonight's experts have to say about what the future may look like. We're pleased to host this evening's speakers, Dr. Donald Hyman and Dr. Larry Bush, both leading experts in the field of infectious diseases. We hope to have time at the end for questions and answers. So you'll all be muted, so please type your questions into the chat box and we'll get to as many as possible. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Donald Hyman, an infectious disease specialist residing in Boca Raton. Dr. Hyman earned his medical degree from Rush Medical College in Chicago, completed his internship and residency at the University of Cincinnati Medical Center, and held a fellowship at Yale University School of Medicine. Among his many accomplishments, Dr. Hyman has practiced medicine for more than 35 years. Taught at several medical schools, including our own Florida Atlantic University, and published vital research in the field of infectious diseases. And now, Dr. Hyman, welcome. And Dr. Hyman will introduce Dr. Larry Bush.
Thank you, Helene. Welcome, everybody. First of all, I want to acknowledge thanks to Helene Paul, the chair of the JCRC, to Marissa Trowbridge, who is the director, and to Marissa Vinograd, who is executive events coordinator. The opportunity to speak to you today is very special to me, and I'm sure to Dr. Bush, because the last 18 months have been very eventful, so to speak. That's obviously a understatement. And it's very important for information to be disseminated to the community that is both accurate and also meaningful. So the way this meeting got arranged, or this program got arranged, was, and I want to thank another individual for that. Dr. Gail Rubin-Quall told me that Helene had asked her if there was a way that we could put together some kind of a program like this. And when Gail asked me, I thought that was an excellent idea. And I was able to think of one person in our area who would be perfect to provide us with the presentation. That was Dr. Larry Bush. And so I'm very happy that he agreed to do so, and thank him for that. Before I go on further, I do want to say that there's been a tragic experience for a lot of us here in South Florida, in the country, in the world. Many people lost loved ones, family members and friends, and I want to send my condolences and represent, if I can, the Federation to all those who have lost family and loved ones during this horrible time in our lives. And for those who are still suffering from the effects of COVID-19, either due to recent infection or even the long haulers, I want to wish a refuah shlema and hope that all recoveries are 100% and they can move on with their lives being still as productive as they were before the pandemic. What's happened over the last 18 months has made us all very tired for a number of reasons, one of which is the fact our lives have changed. And the other is all we're hearing about, all we're seeing, and all we're hearing discussed and argued about seems to be COVID-19. And I appreciate the fact that based on this saturation that we all are experiencing, that people are still interested enough to hear what we have to say about where we've been and where we're going. We've come a long way in the last 6 months since the vaccinations have been approved for emergency use. And I think we can all see the effects of that. The country, particularly even in Florida, for us is our most close experience, is opening up. We're doing things now without masks. We're able to eat inside. We're able to do a lot of the things that we were restricted from because of the need to protect ourselves and others. And with the combination of masking and social distancing and the vaccinations, we've come to a different place today. I guess this is a hyperbolic simile or metaphor, but it's almost like the parting of the Red Sea. Obviously, that was a divine miracle. This is a miracle of our science and the intelligence that we have harnessed as humans. But we have to remember, we've crossed from the horrible period of the pandemic into an area beyond. But what that area beyond is going to be, we don't fully quite know. And it's going to require continued concern on our part to do what we have to do to make sure that we can put this pandemic behind us. It's clear that when we crossed the Red Sea thousands of years ago, we didn't enter the promised land right away, and there were a lot of challenges on the way. And I think that I would say we're now in the convalescent phase of this pandemic, and hopefully we're going to be in the post-convalescent phase very soon. And this is the material that I'm sure that Larry will present in a very cogent and interesting way during his presentation. So it's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Bush, who is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine and did residency and fellowship at the Medical College of Pennsylvania. And he has been in Palm Beach County since the late 1980s for over 3 decades, working as a board certified infectious disease specialist. And he's actually one of the leading infectious disease specialists here in South Florida. He actually had the distinction to be the infectious disease specialist who discovered and diagnosed the anthrax case that was that occurred after the 9/11 tragedy in October of 2001. He is also has an academic appointment, a clinical academic appointment as clinical affiliate professor of medicine at the College of Medicine of Florida Atlantic University and the Miller College of Medicine at the University of Miami. And he was elected in 2020 president of the Palm Beach County Medical Society. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Larry Bush. Thank you, Larry, for agreeing to present today.
Thank you for those kind words, Don, and for everything you do in the infectious community here in South Florida, and for everybody attending, and for the hosts who hostess also who invited me. It's really an honor. So I'm going to get right into it. I'm going to share my slides right here, if it's okay. I assume everybody could see that. And we're going to talk about COVID. And, some of this may be technical, and I don't know everybody's level of, where they are in understanding all this. So I'll do my best to explain things. That's not to say people don't understand. It's just that I never really know if what I'm saying makes a lot of sense. So let's talk about COVID or coronavirus 2019. Where are we now? Where are we headed? And how did we get there? And how are we going to get there? If you look at the history of pandemics, really, a pandemic is really just an epidemic that spread throughout several countries or continents. And an epidemic is just having one case of a disease that occurs at a greater frequency than expected. For instance, if all of a sudden we had 2 cases of Ebola in West Palm Beach, we would have an Ebola epidemic where 2 cases in parts of Africa would just be a normal everyday occurrence. So that is what we define as a pandemic and an epidemic. But when you look at the history of the world over time, as far as that we've documented, these outbreaks are not new. Yes, we are living through one of the worst pandemics that, will be recorded. But look at the others: measles, smallpox, the plague, which was called the Black Death, even malaria to this day. You may not know this, but malaria is the #1 infectious disease in the world. There are more people infected with malaria than any other disease. The #1 cause of infectious disease and death in the world right now is still tuberculosis. And, we don't put those into perspective so well because we live in a part of the world where that doesn't usually occur. And last year, there were only around 8,000 cases out of 330 million people in this country. But it's the #1 cause of infectious disease death in the world. So we've dealt with outbreaks before. We're dealing with one now. We're going to deal with them in the future. And we break these things down into emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases, which really have 3 driving forces. And because of the interplay between these forces and how they change, we're going to see emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases. That's the host, the pathogen in the environment. Some of these things we can control, some of these things we can't. Genetic change we can't control, population density we're not controlling, immunosuppression we're increasing, antibiotic resistance we're increasing. Obviously, there are catastrophic events, urbanization, and climate change going on. So when you put all those together, we have emerging infectious diseases, and we count on the World Health Organization, be that what they are, and the CDC. I sort of put a lot of stock in the CDC. I've known people who work there. I know they're honest folks. They don't really have any gain to be obtained for themselves by saying what they say and do what they do. They say it is. So the global examples of emerging and re-emerging infectious disease, and I borrowed the slide from Anthony Fauci, are either newly emerging in the red, re-emerging in the green, or as Dr. Hyman mentioned, deliberately emerging right here in Boca Raton with anthrax in 2001. But the ones in red are newly emerging. For instance, we didn't see pulmonary syndrome in this part of the world until recently, in the last few decades. Some of the others that are re-emerging in the blue have been around for a while. It's just that we're seeing them in larger percentages now in parts of the world where we didn't see them before. And as I was saying before we got on this talk, some of these emerging diseases aren't so much that they've emerged, is that we now have the technical ability to diagnose them, whereas before we just called them an infection of unknown etiology. Now, throughout history, the way we've controlled infectious diseases in the world hasn't changed. It's sanitation and immunization. The definition of a third world country is based on its life expectancy. Life expectancy drops when the children die of diarrhea diseases. Children die of diarrhea diseases because of dirty water. That's sanitation. And immunization, no matter what you want to think about it, is no denying has changed the world's health in the last several decades. But having said that, the leading causes of infectious disease death are still respiratory infections, because you can't stop respiratory infections unless you wore a very effective face shield 24/7. My wife's a Spaniard. She's the director of pathology at Wellington. And I met her at the University of Miami. And I can tell you it's interesting. She was showing me a video from Peru a few months ago where the Minister of Health was being questioned about the transmissibility of asymptomatic COVID. And she said asymptomatic COVID patients cannot transmit the virus. So there were people in the audience who sort of took umbrage and sort of felt that that was incorrect, and they pushed her on it. So she backed off and she said, well, they can only spread it when they're breathing. Well, enough said about that, right? So that's why respiratory infections are the greatest ones. Why is AIDS still the second leading cause of infectious disease deaths? Now, I told you TB before, because the majority of reason why people die of AIDS in the world is tuberculosis, Africa, different parts of Asia. But the reason why AIDS is number two is because just like you can't stop people from breathing, you can't halt sexually transmitted diseases. And Dr. Hyman can attest to this, that if you look at the most common reportable diseases day in and day out, local, state, and national, the top three are always sexually transmitted diseases. And human papillomavirus will be on there, except we don't have any diagnostic test to report it. Now, let's not forget the second greatest pandemic that we faced in the last 100 years, which was the Spanish flu, of which 675,000 people died in this country. And we're nearing that with COVID. The difference is that the age of and the population density in the United States at that time was greatly smaller. But look at this. Look what happened to the life expectancy between 1918 and 1919. The life expectancy then was around 55. It dropped all the way down into the upper 30s because of the influenza, the Spanish flu. And my wife, as I said, is a Spaniard, wants me to remind you, she always says that when I give this talk, is that Spain didn't cause the pandemic, the Spanish flu. They're the first ones to have recognized it and diagnosed it. So why COVID and why COVID now? Lots of reasons. We disrupt the natural ecosystem. There's climate change to whatever degree going on. There's a global population that's rapidly expanding. Human migration and growth in travel are guarantees that we will always remain at risk for the foreseeable future of pandemics. Look at the world's population. Developed world, underdeveloped world. The developed world is not growing. In fact, I could tell you in certain countries, the birth rate's below the death rate. Actually, the population's shrinking. The less developed world is growing. When Ronald Reagan was president, right around here in the 80s, the world's population was a little bit over 4 billion. The world's population right now is approximately 8 billion people. It took between the first year CE, the current era, until 1827 to populate the world with the first billion. It took us 40 years to go from 4 billion to 8 billion. Look at the prediction as you go on. That is not sustainable. And when you couple that with international travel and commerce, you get this, the global air network on any one given day. Imagine that. You can get from anywhere to anywhere within 24 hours. This is the 24-hour period of commercial air traffic. It's almost hard to not find the green dot, particularly if you look at the United States. People enter this country every day from everywhere, and therefore diseases that we're not used to seeing arrive with them. So let's talk about coronaviruses. Coronaviruses aren't new. They make up 1/3 of the common cold virus, but most of them are not very difficult to deal with because they're not very virulent and we have an immune system response to them. But it's when they mix with peri-domestic animals and they change their genetics, they all have a spike protein which attaches to our respiratory tract cells, a certain receptor. And when a new one arrives that we have no immunity to because it has mixed with other mammals, just as bird flu arrives because it mixes with birds and other intermediate mammals, then we get infected. And it wasn't until 2002 that all of a sudden we had the first coronavirus pandemic, which started in a small province in China. It was called a pandemic because it traveled to 12 countries, but it only infected around 8,000 people, of which around 10% died. Because right away it was recognized, quarantines were undertaken, we didn't have vaccines, we didn't have antivirals, but we recognized it quickly and we did something correctly. Soon after that, some of the authors for medical journals coming out of China wrote this article called Severe Respiratory Syndrome, Coronavirus as an Emerging and Re-emerging Infection. And they warned the world that the presence of a large reservoir of these type of viruses in these bats, together with the culture of eating exotic animals in China, is a time bomb. And were they right? 10 years later, we have MERS, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, another coronavirus, a different coronavirus. This was much more virulent. Only around 2,500 cases were diagnosed up until about a year and a half ago, but the mortality rate was great. It was somewhere around 36%. And a great amount of those people wound up on ventilators. And then all of a sudden, in 2019, the Journal of New England Journal of Medicine publishes this article, a novel coronavirus from patients with pneumonia in China. Now, I know there's a lot of talk about when did the Chinese know? You know, I'm in the camp of, I don't like to think that anybody's being nefarious purposely or being dishonest purposely, but it's hard to believe that people did not know that there was an unusual viral disease going on in a sophisticated country like China before 2019 December, meaning that the virus had a lot of time to get out of that country before at least they recognized it or related to the rest of the world. Now, early on, there was linkage to the wet market. You can look at what was linked, what was not linked in the first week of January, but quickly it became out of the wet market and went from person to person because these people had no link. And within the third week of the pandemic being recognized in China, and then all of a sudden the world looks like this. So then what are the real transmissions? Now, I know we all walk around with alcohol pads or alcohol wipes or disinfectants in our hand, but the truth is this is a respiratory disease. The truth is direct contact with fomites, things you touch, et cetera, really don't transmit the disease. There's been very little proof that that occurs. That doesn't mean it can't occur and that you shouldn't be very cautious about hand hygiene. Of course you should, but it's very little proof that it occurs. Domestic pets, farm animals, yes, domestic pets transmit it between themselves. They don't get very sick, but not the humans. Can a pregnant woman transmit it to her unborn? Hasn't been recognized so far. Fecal oral spread, there is virus in stool, but it doesn't seem to be a way of transmitting it because remember, it has to attach to your respiratory receptor. Sexual transmission, this is not a sexually transmitted disease. And as far as we know, bloodborne doesn't seem to be a method. So then when are the people who are infected at greatest risk of spreading it? Well, this is a PCR test and it's sophisticated. But if you think of the CT value is how many times do you have to spin the wheel to find the PCR? The more you have to spin the wheel down here, That means the less PCR there is or genetic material, which means the less contagious you are. The earlier in the infection, when you don't have to spin the wheel, so to speak, so much to find the genetic material, the RNA that we use to determine that the virus is there, you're more contagious. So it's determined that when you look at all this, your highest contagiousness comes around 3 days before you become symptomatic and ends around 7 days after you've acquired the disease. So let's just say you acquired the disease at day 5, because most people become symptomatic around 5.5 days after acquiring it if they're going to become symptomatic. It's estimated that maybe 40% of the cases go unrecognized because they're not symptomatic. And the only reason you would diagnose them is because of contact tracing or people entering a hospital or wherever to find out. For instance, a lot of these basketball, hockey player, football player, they got checked because it's their standard, not necessarily because they were symptomatic. Like that, the Spaniard golfer a few weeks ago got pulled off the 18th hole at the last second because he tested positive asymptomatically. So you're most contagious around 3 days before you become symptomatic up until day 7. And this is when basically we start to remove quarantine. In the hospital, we remove quarantine on day 10, unless you're very immunocompromised or critically ill, and we extend it to day 20. So why is COVID so clinically relevant? Because we look at what's called the reproduction factor, called the RO. In other words, how many people were an infected individual likely infect symptomatically or maybe asymptomatically? Well, for smallpox, it's 5 to 7. For flu, it's around 2 to 3. For routine flu, it's around 1.3. For COVID, it's felt to be around 2 to 3. Where's that fall? That falls somewhere around the same Spanish flu in 1918. The most contagious respiratory virus that we're aware of is measles. That's why when people in parts of the country refuse to give their children measles vaccines, we suddenly have a measles outbreak, because one case is extremely contagious. And we saw that in California, Oregon, and Washington State in 2018. Now, that doesn't mean that the one infected case is going to infect everybody. Some people become super spreaders. In other words, this one only infected 2, this one infected nobody, but this one infected 4. Now, why did that happen? These are secondarily infection. A super spreader may mean that they don't contain as much virus. They may be more symptomatic. They may have more exposure to people in the workplace or in social settings. So they're the so-called super spreaders. Now, I mentioned surfaces. Yes, you can find coronavirus on steel, wood, glass, paper, plastic, aluminum for several hours. It doesn't tell you how much virus is there and how much contagiousness it has. It doesn't tell you how replicative it is. The bottom line is there's very little data showing that these contacts spread the disease. That doesn't mean you shouldn't wash your hands. It doesn't mean you should cover your face. It doesn't mean you should not be using a hand sanitizer. For all intents and purposes, this is a droplet-borne disease. Droplets drop within 6 feet. Can some stay airborne? Absolutely. But for all intents and purposes, this is the main feature. And if people wear a mask, the purpose of the mask is so that when they do cough, and if they are carrying the virus, it doesn't go out very far and will drop immediately. You wearing a mask doesn't necessarily protect you from airborne disease, because airborne disease has smaller nuclei, and it can go through the routine mask that we generally use, unless you're using what's called an N95. Now, I know most people don't have the chance to look at a chest radiograph. Think about this. This is a chest radiograph. The air is supposed to look dark. This is your heart. This is your diaphragm. This is your diaphragm. This is your stomach under the diaphragm because it has air in it. And you can start to see this white, patchy, fluffy stuff where it should be dark. And if you got a better camera, which we call a CAT scan, you can see why this is a severe respiratory disease. Now, think about this. This person's on a CAT scan machine. They're laying on their back. This is the spine. This is their back. This is their pelvic bone right here. This is their breastbone right here. This is the mediastinum where your heart sits. Your esophagus, your trachea is in here. That's why you see air. Look what's happening to the lung. It looks like Swiss cheese. This is early on in this infected patient. Their lung looks like Swiss cheese. It no longer can exchange air. And even though you kill the virus, all the inflammation causing this Swiss cheese, I'm using that as a very lay term, never goes away. You're left with very destroyed lungs. So if you do survive, you may be a respiratory cripple. You may have pulmonary fibrosis. So then what are the statistics? It's hard to keep up with the statistics, especially globally, because we don't know how well they're reported. But this is from the Johns Hopkins site yesterday, as of 8:21 p.m. There were a total of 178 million cases in the world, 178 million cases, of which 3.8 million have died. And out of that, there have been over 2.6 billion doses of vaccine in the world of almost 8 billion. Now, remember, you need 2 doses with the current vaccines to be immunized. So cut this in half. So that would imply that 1/8 of the world, 1 out of 8, has been fully vaccinated. Which are the worst countries as far as numbers? The US with 33 million cases. Why is that? A lot of reasons. Part of it is because it's much easier to get a test in the US than it is in the Ukraine. Part of it is because it's very hard to tell what the numbers are coming out of some of these countries. You can see who's really a concern right now is India, and I'm going to go on later to mention why. If you look at this, and you can say why the case is a little bit less here, because this was the day before in the US, the 7-day case rate for every 100,000 people who live in this country was only 24.1, meaning as of this day, for the 7 days prior, only 24 people out of every 100,000 people in this country contacted COVID. And that doesn't tell you how many of them were symptomatic or asymptomatic. So we've had around 600,000 deaths, which obviously every death is more than should be. But I want to show you something, and there's a lot of numbers on here, but I want to make a point. Point number 1, the median age in Florida right now is 38. Median is different than mean. Median means that half the people fall below 38, half the people fall above 38. That if you took everybody and put them on a line, the middle would be right here. Point number 1. Point number 2, hospitalizations, which used to be 8%, are cut in half. They're 4%. Mortality rate is around the same, 2%. Let's look at the numbers here, which I think are very important. Age. Everybody says young people don't count. It's the old people who count. What percent of total cases, not new cases, total cases are in people 65 and older? 8, 4, and 2. 10% of all cases in Florida were in people over 65. Now, everybody says, yeah, but they're the ones who are dying. They're more statistically likely to die if they get infected. But the greatest amount of deaths occur in the people who make up the greatest amount of infections, which starts here. The greatest amount of percentage infection has occurred in people 25 to 34. And when you look up the amount of deaths, right, even though they're small percentages, their deaths are more than the people over 65 because they make up a huge larger percent of the cases. This is 8, 12, 14. This is 28, 34, 44. I can do the math. These people make up the majority of cases. So keep that in mind when we get the vaccination. Now, we always said that we want to have a positivity rate of below 4. We're there. Look at Palm Beach County. Same idea. 4% hospitalization, 2% deaths. The people who are over 65 make up 14% of the total cases in Palm Beach County. And remember, we live in the county with the oldest population out of the 63 counties in Florida. So yes, they make up a large percent of deaths. In other words, what percent of this 14% of cases died? A large percent. But the largest percent of cases occurred down here. Why do I tell you that? Because if you were just an average mathematician, and I said to you, who should we have offered the vaccine to? What are you going to say? Right here. That's not what we did. Who's out in the public in the workspace more? Right here. Who's going to heed the warnings about social distancing and mask and hand hygiene? Right here. So that's not to discount the deaths in the people over 65. It's to put things into perspective. And our positivity rate in Florida, in Palm Beach County, really plummeted because we're doing a very decent job. I want to make another point. When I said 2% mortality, that's not mortality, that's case fatality. That means for every diagnosed case in this country, around 1.8% in the US has died for every diagnosed case. How about the 40% who go undiagnosed? Well, that would drop this down to less than 1%. That would mean that less than 1% of all COVID cases in this country died. That's called the case fatality. How about mortality? Mortality rate means if you live in the United States of America right now, what's the chance of dying of COVID? Not saying you have it, not saying you're going to get it, but what's your chance of getting it and dying? In the US, right, let's find the number right here. It's 183 out of every 100,000 population. That's why when you heard people like Dr. Atlas from Stanford, who happens to be a radiologist, and I may not agree with what he says, but one point he said is absolutely true. When you do the math, that means right now in the United States, your chance of dying of COVID for every 100,000 population is less than 2% of 1%, less than 0.2 of 1%. Right now, if you live in the US and said, what's my chance of dying of COVID anytime in my lifetime in the US, I say it's 1/5 of 1%. Do you see why people become apathetic with that number? Now, I don't think he should have been touting that number, because the truth is, if you do get it, you have about a 2% chance of dying if you're symptomatic. So early on, there was a big debate. Do you do mitigation, meaning social distancing, quarantining, hand hygiene, et cetera, or do you do suppression? Suppression means you go out and you find everybody you can who's infected. You test everybody. And if they test positive, you isolate them. And then you test everybody they've been exposed to. And anybody they've been exposed to, you don't care if they're negative, you quarantine them for 2 weeks. And then you go out and you test again. What do you do in the United States of America? You don't have a United States of America. You have a box. The economy totally collapses. So when people get criticized for not, quote, contact testing, this is what would happen. This is exactly what would happen. So I think we sort of did it right. So then what's the ultimate effect? The ultimate effect is that the only way we're going to have salvation and achievement is herd immunity. And the only way that's ever going to occur is the 1918 experiment. Everybody who's going to get sick and die gets sick and die. Everybody who gets sick and lives, sick and lives. Everybody who develops immunity can no longer get infected. Voila, the pandemic ends. Now, we can do that. And remember, 1.8% of everybody who gets sick to wind up sick enough is going to die. 1.8% of a lot of people. I don't think we're willing to do that. Therefore, what do? Vaccines. So herd immunity means how much of the herd has to become immune to protect the people who refuse to get immune or refuse to ever get exposed, purposely or unpurposely. Well, for COVID, it's felt it has to be somewhere around 70%. For measles, it has to be almost 95 to 100%. That's why when you stop vaccinating kids for measles, all of a sudden you get a measles epidemic and maybe a pandemic. So that's the number we're aiming for. Today, the White House came out and said, you know what? We're not going to have 70% herd immunity by July 4th like we hope for. Because let me ask you this, who can't get a vaccine anytime, any day? I have 300 vaccines in my refrigerator in their office waiting to be thrown away because I can't give them away. Who can't get a vaccine anywhere, anytime? So we're at that point. So do I think we're going to get to the 70%? I don't think we're going to get there by vaccination. We're going to get there by natural infection, which is the other way to go. So then, as I said, we count on immunization. So what is a vaccine? Well, the immune system, as a little primer, makes up 2 parts of our body, or we have 2 parts of our body that make it up. The innate immune system is what we're hopefully all born with, and yet, unless we have a genetic immune defect. And we're born with things like skin and mucous membranes and white blood cells and fever and antimicrobial proteins and inflammation. That's all well and good. That works. How do I know that works? That's the pre-vaccine, pre-antibiotic era, right? The world would not have gone from 2 million in the year 1 CE to 1 billion in the year 1827 if we didn't have this. Everybody would have died of infections. It works pretty well. And then we have our adaptive defense, which means that after you've been exposed to something, you adapt to it by producing antibodies, or what we call cell-mediated immunity. Now, there's two ways of acquiring immunity, either naturally by active infection, 1918 flu pandemic, or passively by giving antibodies from the mother via the placenta or infant milk, or artificially by vaccinating or by giving you somebody else's antibody. We'll call that convalescent plasma. So then vaccines are the product, immunization is the effect of what we do. And the idea of vaccination is to attempt to generate an immunologic memory, just as if you've been exposed to the infection before you're exposed to the infection, so that when you do get exposed, your immune system has already adapted. Well, early on, we said, let's get this going, and Trump made a mistake. He should have never courted warp speed. That was such a mistake. You know, when you say the word warp speed coming out of Donald Trump's mouth, regardless of what anybody thinks of him or doesn't think of him, it's not relevant. The bottom line is warp speed sounds like Star Wars. It sounds like comic books. It sounds like Marvel comics. It turns everybody off. Well, that was a scientifically felt to be a good thing. In the Journal of the Medical American Association here in August 2020, they endorsed it. They said, yes, we're not going to create something we don't know. We're going to look at every piece of science that we have on the shelf that we've ever looked at. We're going to engage our best scientists around here in the United States, around the world. We're going to throw money at them. We're not going to depend on industry's money. And we're going to make a warp speed vaccine, because if it's not now, it's never. If it's not us, who? And therefore, they approved 5 vaccines to go into warp speed phase 1, 2, 3 trials. We all know about Moderna. We know about Pfizer. You know, I'm a little offended that it's a German company called BioNTech. And I can tell you somebody at Penn developed the messenger RNA 40 years ago and now works for BioNTech. Pfizer really has just had the ability to manufacture it. BioNTech is the one who really put the science together. Merck abandoned their vaccine early on in the trial. Johnson & Johnson, you know about, and AstraZeneca is a great vaccine. I'm the principal investigator in Palm Beach County here for these 2 vaccines. And I could tell you, I'll tell you some of the data, but you know, why this isn't approved in the US is strictly political. It's the #1 vaccine in the world. In fact, everybody in our trial now gets a CDC card, because the CDC said, you know what? The World Health Organization is using this vaccine throughout the world. Why should we punish our people who volunteered to be in the trial and not give them a vaccine card? So everybody's getting one of them now. So if you look at this, this is the problem. How do you counterbalance the facts and the myths? I mean, I tell people, if you're an anti-vaxxer and that's not what you are, and you just don't believe in it, that's a faith system. It's like religion. It's like, do you like vanilla ice cream? No, I can't make you like it. It's like religion. Can I give you some hard science proof of a higher being, of a spirit? No, but I can have faith in it. Einstein had faith in it. And that guy only dealt in numbers and facts. So we work on facts, which in medicine, Dr. Hyman can tell you, is evidence-based. I mean, when you go to a health store and pick up any supplement and you read the claims, and then you read the asterisk that says, this has never been proven to be true in any scientific study, what's that say? That's like me saying, jump off the roof and flap your arms because I think you're going to fly. And you say, well, how do you know that? And I say, well, I just know that. Has anybody done that experiment? Yeah. And they all fell to the ground. So then the first vaccines that came on the market were the messenger RNA vaccines, and everybody said, wow, messenger RNA vaccines, that's scary. You're going to give, as Dr. Hyman was saying before, you're going to put a piece of genetic material in them. No, what these vaccines do, whether it's a Johnson & Johnson AstraZeneca, which is called a viral vector, it's a common cold adenovirus that cannot infect us. One uses a human one. AstraZeneca uses a chimpanzee. But what both of these messenger RNA vaccines and viral vector vaccines do is they take the spike protein, a piece of protein, they incorporate it into the vaccine. So when it's injected to us, we recognize it as foreign, and we produce antibodies to this foreign piece of material. There is no virus here. There is no genetic material incorporating into us. You cannot change somebody's genetics by doing this. all you can do is produce antibodies against the spike protein, which then attaches to our respiratory cells to infect us. So the first trial was published in December in the New England Journal. This is the Pfizer vaccine. They took 39 or 38,000 people, broke it up 50-50 vaccine placebo. They gave them a second dose 3 weeks later, and they looked at the result. They first said, is it equivalent? Does everybody who gets the vaccine look like everybody who gets placebo? Yeah, a third of them were by definition overweight. About half of them were 16 to 55. About 40% of them were over 55. Unfortunately, there were only around 9% African Americans, but it was equal on both arms. And they looked at the data. Now, here's what gets me. This is not just lay people, but it's a lot of medical providers. I don't really think they understand the result. Number one, the result was not to say whether you got COVID or not. The result was to say whether you got symptomatic COVID. Because I could tell you in all these trials, there are many, many, many people who get COVID asymptomatically. Now, how do I know that? Because in both of my trials, we check you for COVID all the time. And unless we count you as symptomatic, in other words, you report a symptom and you test positive, if you test positive and don't report a symptom, you're called protected. You're not a failure. You have to have primary disease efficacy confirmed by symptomatic COVID 7 days after the second dose, not after the first, 7 days after the second dose, and you have to have symptoms. Now, here's the other part. Everybody says, wow, 95% protective. A, yes, for symptomatic disease. Doesn't necessarily mean asymptomatic disease. But B, how did they get that 95%? Because out of that 18,000 people who got placebo, how many had symptomatic COVID? Only 162. Think about that. 18,500 people who only got placebo didn't get COVID. Think about that for a second. How many who got the vaccine out of 18,198 got COVID? 8. That is 5% of 162. Now think about this. 38,000 people, 36, whatever the math here in this study, only 170 got symptomatic COVID. This is in South Florida where there was a large outbreak of COVID. That doesn't mean you shouldn't get it. This is very good. What this means is, what we can tell you is that if you get this vaccine and if you get COVID, which you may asymptomatically, you won't get severe disease and you probably won't get even symptomatic disease. If you say to me, well, can I get COVID? The answer is yes. Can I transmit it even if I get it not symptomatic? Well, that study's about to begin. Moderna is about to begin that study with people who've been vaccinated. So let me show you something else. This is the efficacy. As the lines separate, this is the people who got placebo, the red. This is the people, these are the people who got vaccine. You can see that they really don't start to separate until around day 10 or 11. And they really statistically don't start to separate until day 21, which is after you've gotten your second vaccine. And the real date that they use is 7 days after the 21 period, which is right here, because this is where they start to separate statistically. So that 95% is right here, 28 days after your first dose, 7 days after your second dose. Do you have protection here? Yes. You just don't have statistically significant protection. Now, here's what they also said. They said, does it protect people against asymptomatic disease? We don't know. Can they spread it to other people? We don't know. How do you deal with the people who missed their second dose? We don't know. Now, let me explain to you what an EUA is. Right after anthrax in 2001, the government said, you know what? We don't have vaccines that are very good for anthrax. We don't have medications that are very good for anthrax. We need to be able to distribute things right away before we do full approval. Most vaccines take 2 to 4 years to have full approval. And EUA means it's emergency use authorization, which means tomorrow, if the FDA believes that the Pfizer vaccine is more harmful than helpful, there will no more be Pfizer vaccines in this country. It can be withdrawn at any one time. That's why the military cannot make their recruits take the vaccine, because it's not an approved vaccine. It's an emergency authorized. And you can see, you've had the vaccine, you know, there's some of the side effects are mild, some are moderate, some are local, some are systemic, but we tend to get over them. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine had less efficacy, but it was 100% protective against severe disease, only 71% protective against symptomatic disease, but they only use 1 dose. They're currently finishing the trial with 2 doses. Now, they got a problem. Shortly after, all of a sudden, we started seeing the reports of people getting blood clots. Around 13 women, younger women, who got the vaccine out of 7 million, had blood clots in their brain, in their abdomen, in different parts of their body, and it was felt probably related to the vaccine. Let's put that into perspective. That's a 0.004%, 0.0004%. How often do women on birth control pills get a blood clot? A lot more often. How often do smokers get a blood clot? A lot more often. How often do people who get natural COVID get a blood clot? Multitudes more often. Which risk do you want to take? This one or this one? The FDA said, we're going to pause the vaccine. And after they looked at all the statistics, they said, yes, we think there's a chance of blood clots. We think it's very, very small. We think the benefit outweighs the risk. And as I told you, the AstraZeneca vaccine is very, very effective. It was more effective in people over 65 than people under 65. But even in the people who were under 65, the numbers are right up there. That's why it's the #1 used vaccine in the world. And hopefully we're going to see it here. So shortly after vaccines were released, emergency use authorization, the ACIP, which works for the CDC, got together and said, who are we going to vaccinate? And they said, do we want to prevent morbidity and mortality, or do we want to preserve social function? If you want to do this, this is who you go after. That's younger people. If you want to do this, this is who you go after. That's elderly people. Now, why did they go here? I don't have any problem with them going here because the AARP is a huge voting bloc. That's my personal feeling. The AARP is a huge voting bloc. Let me say this. You may not know this, but at the beginning of January 2020 in Tallahassee, we were the 21st state to pass that nurse practitioners and physician's assistants can practice independent of physicians. I was the president of Palm Beach Medical Society then. And we took offense to that because you know, nurse practitioners and PAs are great, but they're great at what they are, and they're not physicians. They do not operate, but there are nurse practitioners who are surgeons, right? But they're not doing the operation. So to basically say that they can do the cognitive medicine as well as a physician, I take offense to. I'm sure Dr. Hyman takes offense to. But having said that, we were assured at the Palm Beach County Medical Society by the people in Tallahassee and by the Florida Medical Society, which makes up 26,000 doctors. By the way, Palm Beach County has the largest medical society of all in Florida. We have 1,600 active doctors. But we were assured by Governor DeSantis that he would not sign that bill if it passed. The bill passed, he signed it in 20 minutes. Now, I'm not saying I'm nothing against DeSantis, you know, it doesn't really matter. I'm not a political guy, but what I'm saying is I know why he signed it. And I asked the president of the Florida Medical Society, he told you personally at a meeting that I was privy to when he said, if you want to be a doctor, go to medical school. I said, he told you he wouldn't sign it. And he said, yeah, but the AARP is a huge voting bloc in Florida. So this is what they rolled out. We're going to go for the elderly, long-term care. Then we're going to go for healthcare workers, frontline, and essential workers. Well, the essential workers are mostly younger people. So how well did we do in the world so far? Well, you can look at it by percent of the population of your country or how many people you vaccinated in your country. Well, if you look at the best countries, there's one up here I never heard of. I guess I'm ignorant to that. I don't even know where they are. But they had the best percent in the world. They vaccinated a higher percent of their population than anybody else in the world. You know, the other countries you can see here, Israel, Malta, Bahrain, Mongolia, Chile, United Kingdom. United States looks pretty good here. We vaccinated fully around 40-some% of our population. Remember, we have 330 million people. So how many people have we vaccinated? Wow, we're leading the pack right after China. I don't know how good this data is here. China has a lot more people than us. Remember, we only make up 4.8% of the total world's population, although we're the third most populated country. We vaccinated 150 million people, right? Fully vaccinated, which is around 45% of the country. But our percent isn't where it has to be. How about United States altogether? Right here, 45% of the population has been vaccinated fully as of 2 days ago. Now, we've had vaccines for 7 months. That's why when Biden said we're going to reach 70% in 2 more weeks, I said, no way, no how, because we've hit the wall. And it's not so much that we've hit the wall with the people who are waiting to see. The anti-vaccine people, you're never going to convince. The people who are waiting to see, what I ask them is, what are you waiting to see and how will you know when you see it? It's the apathetic. That's the group we just can't get to. Let's look at the states, percent of the population fully vaccinated. Let's see where Florida is. Florida is very good on numbers. We vaccinated around 8 million people fully, but we have 23 million people living in our state. We're the third most populated state. So percentage-wise, we're not in the blue, we're in the yellow, which is not great. If you look at, I can break down the numbers which say, we're moving along slowly, so I'm going to skip that. You can look at the numbers. But in Palm Beach County, so far, our numbers are not great. They're getting there, but they're not great. And then all of a sudden, we get variants, right? And we get questions. Do you vaccinate children? Do you interchange vaccines, boosters? Do you vaccinate immunocompromised? How about pregnant women and lactating? None of these people were in the trials. But the science suggests that it is safe to vaccinate them. Once you get vaccinated, the CDC says you can do this. My answer is do what makes you comfortable. There's no guarantee. Do what makes you comfortable. I can tell you that the last 10 cases of people I've admitted to the hospital or been consulted on in the hospital with COVID, none of them got vaccines. 3 of them are right now on a ventilator in the ICU, never get off, and 2 of them have died. And I've asked their family members, why didn't your mother or father, because most of them are elderly, get a vaccine when it's obvious they could have? Their answer either is they don't believe in it or they were waiting to see. And I said, well, I guess, not to be glib, but I said to myself, I guess we've seen. So then we start to see variants, and variants are a concern. The first ones we started seeing came out of Great Britain. Once they're in your country, the people who are going to get disease are going to replicate that virus. The virus cannot live outside of a human. It's going to do whatever it can to mutate to survive. It's going to find somebody who's not immune. It's eventually going to find somebody who's immune because of a vaccine that doesn't protect against that variant. And we're going to be stuck with the so-called variant that everybody's concerned about right now, which is the one from India. And remember, India has a large population that is heavily unvaccinated. So these are the yet to be answered questions. How long is immunity going to last? We don't know that. We're doing that. That's why these trials go on for years. Are you immune after vaccination? Dr. Hyman brought up a great point before we went live, which is when you go get a blood test after your vaccine to see if you have antibodies, the laboratory who is testing you specifically says in their package insert, don't use this test to determine whether your vaccine has worked, because it doesn't necessarily determine it, because the vaccine efficacy, according to the studies, looks at a lot more than that simple antibody called the spike IgG that the Quest of the LabCorp is doing. So our recommendation is don't do that. Assume you are vaccinated. Which vaccine's the best? Well, that's like you have 5 people running a race and none of them are running against each other and they don't have a timer. These are not tested against each other. My answer is get whichever one you can get as quickly as possible. Are we going to need boosters for this or for the future ones? Yes, I believe we are. Should children be vaccinated? The studies that we have so far prove if it's effective and it's safe. Yes. Did we all of a sudden have a case of pericarditis and myocarditis, all of which got better quickly? Yes. But we also, as I showed you, have the median age dropping, which means the children are getting infected. And although you hear that the children may not be spreading it to people, they can spread it. Maybe not to the same extent, but that's what the current variant that we have, that can change. Should pregnant women get infected? I think they had to discuss that with their obstetrician, but the recommendations, at least for myself, and I don't know Dr. Hyman's take, is that yes, I would. Would I do it in the first trimester? Personally, I probably would not, because there's a lot of things going on then, but definitely thereafter. And plus they produce antibodies that they transmit to the newborn. What are the long-term side effects of these vaccines? Well, we're going to find out. We do know the long-term side effect of COVID. How about breakthrough infections? What's that? People say, I've been vaccinated, but I was diagnosed with infection. Most of those don't wind up in the hospital. And we're going to see if most of them turn out to be variants. So yes, there will be breakthroughs. Remember, 5%, if that's the vaccine number that we use for protection, out of 150 million people who've been vaccinated is 7.5 million people. That means they did not develop immunity well enough to keep them from getting infected. What will happen with the variants? I talked about that. So my last two slides. So the key pandemic really is a question that goes far beyond science. How safe is safe? People say to me, is it safe for me to go on a plane? I say, you know what? That's an independent decision. I think it's as safe as it's going to be if you take all the precautions. How do you best balance saving the most lives versus saving the most of our way of life? How do you balance that? That's not a scientific question. These are political questions, and they must be answered by due deference to the interests and the opinions of the public, not just the scientists. And that's why, and I was saying before we went on, Anthony Fauci, trained under the same people I do. I personally know him. He's older than me. I want to say that right off the bat. And I believe he's an honest, very smart guy telling you what he says. But he's not giving you opinions, and people want his opinion. He's giving you the science as he knows it, as it's evolving. So then I think this is the greatest publication when it comes to pandemic, the book, The Plague, Albert Camus. And in this book, he basically said, ultimately, we're going to look for immunization. He didn't say that. But in this book, the protagonist is asked, how do you manage the wave of all these patients with the plague, the Black Death? And he said, the only way to fight the plague is with decency. And somebody said, well, what exactly is decency? And that's a question that certainly today, in today's world, that is a great question. My answer to that is, doing our job. And I think that JFK said it best in his quote when he said, there are risks and costs to action, but they're far less than the long-range risks of comfortable inaction. Nike says it best when they say, just do it. Just go out and get a vaccine. And when there's a booster, get a booster vaccine. And when there's yearly COVID vaccines, get your yearly COVID vaccine. I am so sorry I went so far over, but thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Bush. Dr. Hyman, I don't know if you have Dr. Hyman, if you have anything you want to say in closing. Most of the questions have been answered, and I know we went so long. I do have one question from a healthcare worker, and she is asking if Dr. Bush can comment about the J&J vaccine in terms of the Delta variant doing better with 2 doses. I think you sort of answered that.
Yeah, so we don't know. So right now we're doing the 2-dose trial. So we're comparing 1 dose to 2 dose. So we're looking at the people who do develop COVID in either one of those and seeing if it's one of the variants. So that data will be come out later. Now, remember, the Pfizer and the Moderna trials were done very early in the pandemic when there were very few variants. And the 1-dose Johnson & Johnson also was done early in the pandemic, where the variant percentage was much less. The data that these companies are giving us, and I can personally tell you about the AstraZeneca because I'm very involved in that, is that it looks okay for the variants, but they're not going to go on the record to say it's protective. So what I know is going to happen next is Moderna and Pfizer and J&J and AstraZeneca are already looking at making the same type of vaccine with more strains of COVID protein in it for the variants. That's going to happen.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Dr. Hyman, thank you.
I just want to thank Dr. Bush for an excellent presentation. I had nothing but that expectation, and again, it was wonderful.
Thank you. And I'm sorry I talked so long and so much.
No, not at all. I think you covered everyone's questions.
Great.
As I went through the list, I could tick them off. But I want to thank you all, both doctors taking time out of your busy schedule. We all really appreciate all of your work, along with your colleagues, the frontline workers that put your lives at risk every day. And you all work tirelessly to help get this pandemic under control. I was Certainly, I think our audience was pleased to hear the statistics for Palm Beach County, so thank you again. And I just want to say good night to everyone and thank you all for making this a wonderful success.
And thank you for the invitation. Thank you.
Thank you, doctors. Good night.
Good night.